way, Trent, so I'll have no idea when you're counting down. Oh, great. Thanks, Trent. There we go. No countdown this time. Hello, welcome to the Sunday Science Q&A Live. And we have today's show is going to be predominantly looking at different ideas and different things that we know and things that we don't know about mental health. So I will mention right at the beginning, just to say that there might be at times issues, for instance, talking about suicidal feelings, suicidal thoughts and other parts of mental health. So for any points that you feel that this is not the afternoon that you want to watch this, just say, but it's going to be dealt with by people who really know what they're talking about as well. So if you can, I would highly advise that you do stay with this, because this is no tabloid expose that is going to be occurring. I would tell you also a few other things that are going on. Just to mention our 24-hour show, as some of you will know, sadly, both our Compendium of Reason, the show that I do with Brian Cox at Hammersmith Apollo, and also the run that we normally do at King's Place of 9 Lessons and Carols for Curious People. Both of those obviously are kind of not happening. The Compendium will be moved to July. It's going to be the most Christmassy July show that you're ever going to see. But we decided that it was terrible to have a run up to Christmas without actually doing some kind of live event. So on the 12th of December at midday, we will start a 24-hour show with scientists, comedians, musicians, all of the normal kind of people who would be in the show, but 24 hours. And also it's going to be more international than it would normally be. And we've got some fantastic guests from Australia and Canada and the US as well. We've got Chris Hadfield and Helen Sharman and Brian Cox and Sophie Ellis-Bextor, Tanita Tickeram, and yes, the bill is, it's building and building and building, obviously, because the trouble is in the show, everyone only ever does 8 minutes, and that's fine when it's a 3.5-hour show, but with a 24-hour show, I might allow them all to do 10 this year. I think that's going to be a little change in the rules. Also mention the latest book Shambles that are up. Mark Watson talking about his new novel, and generally just us rambling on quite a lot, myself and Josie Long with Mark Watson, and also the Science Shambles, Becky Ragg-Sykes, who's written a fantastic book about the knowledge that we're gaining about Neanderthals, which is it's particularly exciting. It's a very kind of 21st century part of of paleontology, of genetics, and her book is absolutely wonderful. That's kindred, and also Tim Peake talking about his autobiography. That's another one that we've got up at the Science Shambles. And Dean is doing a series of articles for Shambles on his Brain Yapping blog, which about mental health hacks. And next week, just so you know, it's about oceans and ocean pollution. So don't prepare your questions till 4 o'clock. Continue to have your questions ready about the nature of the brain, first of all, and the nature of our minds. And then from 4 o'clock onwards, start thinking about oceans and ocean pollution. That's the way the rules are for today. And also mention, if you can support us in any way via Patreon, that is very, very important, because all of the live work, I should be on tour at the moment, and Josie would have been on tour, and Trent and I would have been doing lots of live shows. Of course, the majority of things we do are live, and those things are not happening anymore. So if you are able to support us via Patreon, we generally try every week to make 4 or 5 shows, and we try and make them as often as possible accessible to everyone, so people can get them for free. But we only get about 1% of people who watch the shows actually are able to contribute or do contribute or donate. We would love to get that up to 5%, because that will make a huge difference to the way that we can keep all of these things going. That's the end of the begging. Now we move on. So our guest today, as I said, we'll meet them both shortly. But first of all, the regular co-host of the show is Helen Czerski. Hello, Helen.
Hello. I all these exciting. So I feel as though today I'm going to be, obviously not a mental health expert, but I do think I have a mind at least some of the time. So I haven't got a show and tell today, but I did think that for the first time, actually, I tell you why. It's because I realised I could do it better with a bit of preparation. So it's going to come back in 2 weeks' time in a better version, the thing I was going to do today.
Have you got an even bigger vat to place your oranges and limes to discover the flotation techniques of various different citrus fruits and beyond?
I'm not telling. You'll have to wait for 2 weeks to find out. But what I did want to tell everyone about was something that people may have seen me tweet, and it does relate to the mental health issue topics, I think, which is that, many of you will know I talk about outrigger canoes a lot. I paddle on the Thames. These are very narrow canoes. They sit very high on the water. You become almost a part of the environment in them. And out on the Thames here, one of the things that has been nice, so Hammersmith Bridge, famous bridge in London, has been closed, but it's stopped a lot of river traffic. And what that means is that when we paddle on the Thames up here, we have it almost completely to ourselves. And that we've been going out at dusk, because that's when, it's like after work, you've got this little window. And what's been really nice the past couple of weeks has been paddling upriver and then what we're doing now, we've sort of given up pretending to train. We just drift downstream and watch the wildlife. And we've been seeing seals, and everyone's always surprised that you get seals so far inland. But of course, the Thames is actually a lot healthier than everyone thinks it is. These seals have had massive fish, literally like this, that you can see them when they come up to the surface waving the fish around, taking chunks out of it. But what's really nice about those bits on the river, so first of all, I want to tell everyone there are seals in the Thames. They are perfectly fine. They are healthy. They are stuffing themselves on all the fish that go through their juvenile stage in the Thames. But also just that even in the cities, there are little windows where wildlife is still there. And that one of the nicest things I do each week at the moment is just float in a canoe with a couple of friends. And we just watch the bank, and we watch the geese going overhead and the herons that are pretending to be statues. And it is just, there's very few places in a city where it feels like you can find peace and quiet. And actually, I think that there are corners that we could probably all do a bit better looking for. So I just wanted to share that the moment of peace I get each week is usually watching for a seal on very still water at dusk on the Thames. And it is a very nice thing to do.
That's a nice show and tell, because it's one that everyone can now go off, and so yeah, that's a show and tell that continues beyond the consumption of the citrus fruit. Now, Dean, Robin, thank you so much for joining us. It's always I've had so many fascinating conversations with you. Gig together, probably in Cardiff. I think it was
Cage Monkey's tour.
Yeah, and that's nearly 10 years ago now. Can I ask you, do you have a show and tell? I think you have a show and tell, because I noticed you turned your camera off and then suddenly went off screen in that kind of way where people go, "Oh, I forgot about the show and tell." Yes, so let's find out.
Literally exactly what happened. It's just basically something I have lying around here. It's this. It's a small brain-shaped stress ball. You can sort of squeeze it like that, and I've accumulated like about a half a dozen of these over the years. I can't find most of them now. This is the most present one in that it's here, and it's sort of like I get it. Like, you go to neuroscience conferences or psychology conferences, and obviously the brain is the focus, and they have some sort of merchandise. It's either pens or notepads or like tote bags, whatever. And sometimes you get these brain-shaped stress balls. And I just sort of, it strikes me as like, only today I was thinking about it because we talk about mental health and how to unwind and stuff, and stress is a big part of mental health. So it's kind of useful to have the ability just to enact that stress on something. But I guess like more the neuroscience conferences I go to, like the whole point of them is to teach people new things about the brain. And I guess one of the main take-home messages about the brain is, if you ever get hold of one, do not, under any circumstances, squeeze it. But that seems to be a repeated message at all these conferences. So yes, so this thing is potentially useful, but also dangerous. And I have several lying around, which is potentially of interest to someone. I don't know what to do with that, but there it is.
Can I ask you about this? The kind of stress ball thing, going years ago when I used to, those youthful days where you share a Victorian kind of par with about 12 other enacting episodes of The Young Ones, really. And one of our flatmates used to, when she got angry, which was quite frequently, she would sing Summertime very aggressively and get a baseball bat and repeatedly hit these pillows. Now, I've heard that actually things like that are not good way. They don't get rid of your anger. Is that true? So sometimes when people get the anger out of you, that might not actually be an effective way of getting rid of anger. I
guess it would get rid of potentially the inherent motivation that comes from within when you're angry. Like you have two at the most basic level, you have two motivation systems in the brain: approach and avoid. And anger seems to trigger the approach system. It makes you want to do something. It compels you to action. So acting on that, doing something in response to the anger, would potentially, sort of excise that tension, that build up there. But it won't actually do anything about the source of the anger. So if it can make you feel better briefly. It's like maybe it's like a short-term solution in that, right, I feel better now, but the thing that's making me angry, which hasn't gone away, also makes you angry again. So I guess if you just want to get rid of some tension, fair enough. But if you're thinking that'll fix my anger problem, then it necessarily wouldn't, because the underlying cause, it's masking symptoms, maybe. That's how a handy way to look at it in that respect.
Also, it makes very flat pillows, so then you don't sleep well and you wake up with a crook neck. So there's a lot of this that brings in sleep-based issues as well. Nav, last time I saw you, I think was in Manchester, up in when we were doing Curious People for Curious People up there.
That seems like a long time ago, doesn't it?
Anything which involved going out and appearing in front of audiences seems like a very, very long time ago. It seems like sometimes a magical dream. Can I ask you, what is your show and tell for today?
I'm delighted you've asked me to bring a show and tell. I feel like I'm 10 again. So my show and tell is 3 things. It's this. It's some feta cheese. Feta cheese. Okay.
Is this about to be a magic trick?
Just wait and see, Helen. Some cigarette papers there. See those?
Okay.
And some toilet roll.
Yeah.
Okay,
Back to student days.
Yeah.
This is like when a post-apocalyptic version of the Shopping Channel.
Yeah.
Or Generation Game.
Funny you should say that. So this is a reminder, a kind of illustration of the wonderful diversity of the kind of human behavioural response, because those are all things that were panic bought at the beginning of all this. So in Greece, sales of feta cheese went up 20%. In the Netherlands, there were queues outside coffee shops for cannabis and cannabis-related products, and of course here we queued up and fought over toilet rolls. So it's just people do different things in response to kind of the lockdown. And what's quite interesting is there's a panic index that colleagues have developed. So it's an index of panic buying, and sadly we didn't even top the world on the panic buying index. The Australians topped that, both in the kind of trajectory of their buying and their quantity of buying unnecessary items. But it's just an illustration that all behavioural responses vary. No two people react in the same thing to anything.
And what did the Australians buy? Like, they
also fought over toilet roll, just more kind of enthusiastically than us. But it's the same things as people panic bought here: non-perishable goods, that kind of thing. Kind of the hoarding mentality. The Germans have got a name for it, haven't they? It's to do with hamsters, kind of hoarding things. I think it's
it's interesting. I'm intrigued because, again, also thinking about the periods of time where sometimes we read about the development of the human brain and about the kind of the anal oral development, and some of those are orally fixated, some of them are anally so that also has, perhaps from a Freudian and beyond perspective, something that it says about the values and some of the development, neural development of us, does it?
It's a bit early in the show for a kind of Freudian formulation, Robin. But you could
never too early for a Freudian formulation.
Or you could take a more pragmatic view: is that people were scared. They were scared of running out of food. Why people were scared of running out of toilet paper, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, you could try a psychodynamic formulation. I quite like the practical one.
At the start of the pandemic, there was a big thing a lot about wildlife coming back to the streets because obviously people are indoors. But in Australia, that's a much bigger threat, I guess. So maybe people were far less willing to leave the house as a result and shop because of the spiders. I've never been, but I've been told they're large. So theory.
The large ones aren't it's the really small ones that get.
Oh, of course. Well,
still, whenever I go to Australia, I still shake out my shoes in the morning. It's ridiculous. What a foolish old man. Well, we now have so many questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for sending the questions in. I should also say, if you want to ask questions, you can either go to our Twitter at Cosmic Shambles, or you can actually in the chat boxes as well. And Trent will make sure that I see those. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there may be some mental health issues that we deal with where if you just want to be aware, I'm not entirely sure sometimes the directions we're going to go in, but please just be aware of that. I'm going to start off with Bagsy, and I'll probably throw this to you first of all. Bagsy says, I'm a long-time sufferer of anxiety and took steps after a long wait on a waiting list for an appointment to fight back against this. COVID happened, and then the scaffolding put in place disintegrated beneath me. I'm okay, but are there any generic hints or tips to help people deal with the increase of the mental health strain?
It's a really tricky situation, this, for all of us, and you're absolutely right. One of the big stories of the pandemic and the aftermath is people are less able to access traditional sources of support. I mean, a lot of my colleagues in the third sector, in the charity sector, providing kind of online support. So there is plenty of online help out there. But the kind of tips and tricks and kind of hints to improve your mental health, I'm sure Dean's going to have lots of tips himself. But it's about what works for you. So what works for me is kind of, the usual things, kind of watching what I eat, exercise, but also kind of distraction, recognizing that sometimes I'm going to have bad days, making sure that I'm doing stuff even when I'm not feeling like doing stuff. So it's about kind of finding what works for you, but actually there's quite a lot out there as well at the moment.
And Dean?
I'm doing a little series about this right now as part of the Shambles Network, the mental health hacks. I asked for people to submit their own on World Mental Health Day last week, and it's again like Nav said, it's all about what works for you. But there are certain options you can take when it comes to taking things into your own hands. Like some people say about going outside is in itself just a helpful thing. Not on a not a sort of preachy, it's healthier, go outside thing, but it can be. As far as the physical benefits are concerned, also there's the effect of fascination, the fact that the human brain seems to have evolved to appreciate green and natural scenes, which draw our attention in less demanding or less taxing ways, and can cause a better recovery rate and things like that. So there are lots of little tips and tricks that the brain offers. People offer things like distraction, like background noise or certain sort of music while they do things. People say audiobooks or podcasts, just things which sort of occupy the part of your brain which may be overactive right now. And again, there's no way to say which one will definitely work for you, but certain approaches can possibly work. But I think there's one particular aspect which is probably worth bearing in mind, is that obviously coming from the skeptic community originally, perhaps there's a lot of scoffing or dismissal of things like alternative remedies, which is fine when it comes to physical problems like anything which is like a virus or a broken bone. But when it comes to reducing anxiety, and then the line between real therapies and made-up therapies is kind of a lot more blurred, because if your problem is too much anxiety and something like aromatherapy reduces your anxiety, it has arguably worked. So I guess if you're looking for approaches, keep more of an open mind than you would if you don't need something which is scientifically and rigorously tested. If something actually does help you, then it is logically helping you because it's a psychological problem. So yeah, so you can also broaden your vista a bit when it comes to looking for things to potentially help you in what you're going through.
I have a question about online things, because it seems that there is a tendency in some parts of the modern world to basically there's an app for that. There's an app, there's a website, and I often wonder, I'm sure those things can be helpful, but it feels like to me, especially when the problems are isolation, that what you want is another person, like a physical thing. And I was wondering whether there's any evidence about the difference between online only interactions, which I get can be helpful, but they kind of feel shallow to me, versus just a physical, like actually going outside or seeing a real person for a short period instead of an online person for a longer period. Where's the balance there? Because obviously a lot of the world is online now.
Yeah, it's surprising. It's surprising because actually, Helen, some people prefer the online world. So actually, one of the things we've realized during the course of all this is actually for some people, the hassle of, having to get out of the house, getting the kids in the car, going to the local clinic, arranging an appointment, waiting, that's gone in some senses because you're seeing your therapist directly online. So there are positives as well as negatives. And I'd just like to echo what Dean said about, things being evidence-based. So in my day job, that's what I'm obsessed with. We recommend evidence-based therapies. And there is a reasonable evidence base for online therapies, randomized controlled trials for depression and other things that say these work. But you're right, they're not for everyone. So, I quite like the kind of face-to-face. I like to be able to kind of see people. You can perhaps judge emotions, judge body language a bit more directly. But again, not for everyone. So there is an evidence base for these things. But you're right, you can't have a one-size-fits-all, I don't think.
Well, actually, the thing I was thinking of, sorry, I know the audience is supposed to be asking the questions, not me, but is actually these sort of ideas of an AI chatbot. And I think that if I was anxious, the last thing I want is to feel I'm being fobbed off by a computer talking to me. There's that kind of thing. And yet there seems to be a growing, we'll just have a little AI that will sort that out. What's your view on those, or the evidence?
So that's really interesting. Don't get me started on AI. I think if people know it's not a real person, that can potentially be a big problem, and I would have some grave doubts about that kind of thing. But Dean, I know you've written about some of this. You've written about the kind of avatar therapy and things like that, which seems quite interesting. That's different, I think. But
yeah,
the idea that I'm just chatting to an automated kind of bot that's picking up on my cues and responding in an emollient fashion, I'm not sure I'd want that, and I'm not sure there's any evidence for that being effective.
Yeah, I mean,
Dean,
I think,
do you want to? Yeah.
yes, of course. That would be. I mean, that is an ideal scenario in that if you can say, here is a software program which will fix your mental health, that would obviously free up a lot more resources, a lot more time. You could, you haven't got to schedule half-hour appointments with a trained expert. I mean, it would be a massive boon, but the idea that it's anywhere close to being widely available now, I think, is kind of not deluded, but borderline extremely optimistic in that, like, we've all seen this. We've all had it in that if you think you're talking to a robot or a machine, you don't have any interest. Like, even if, like, when you through the automated call system, like, finally a human, people have said that so much. Or even on a train station with the recorded voice saying, I am extremely sorry for the delay to the train. No, you're not sorry. You're a machine. You don't care. And it feels worse than not. If an actual person just said, I'm really sorry, I don't know what's going on here, you probably would feel a lot better, because we have evolved for human communication. So much of the human brain is about interaction and communication and reading what people are saying, tones, inflections, body language, posture, facial expressions. There's so much information in interpersonal communication that you don't get in an online scenario. But knowing there's someone else on the other end of the connection is a big part of it. Thinking that there's not, well, again, you do suddenly have that, oh, I'm wasting my time here, because if you're not talking to an actual person, you don't give it the same value or the same sort of investment that you would if it was an actual person. And that is a big hurdle to overcome when it comes to online therapies and stuff. If it's therapy which occurs over the internet, I can get on board with. Therapy which is just a machine telling you what you should be hearing, that's a long way off before that becomes viable in the grand scheme of things.
I was just going to mention about the avatar therapy. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in terms of avatar therapy being used for people with intrusive inner voices. Charles Fernhoff's book, The Voices Within, is very I recommend that. And also, just in terms of, I was just going to add in the problems when some people have had some support cut off. Or much support cut off during this period. There's the other side that we've talked about before, which is sometimes trying to concentrate on things such as the anxiety you're not having to deal with because many of these things have been cut off. And I don't know how useful that is to people, but I've certainly found it useful sometimes to think, hang on a minute, normally by this point when I've had to go and do this and I've been worrying about that and I've been worrying about all this, I've got quite an active imagination, which is entirely negative active imagination. It never turns into novels, it just turns into paranoia on public transport. But I have found that sometimes trying to think, hang on a minute, what are you not having to deal with today? I don't know if anyone has it, but that has been useful.
I think that's right. You sometimes kind of forget, dare I say that there are, positive aspects to some of this. I've been dying to get back into my office at the university, and I went back into the office and I just realized what a pain it was. I had to kind of get in the car, I had to go up the multi-story, I had to kind of, my swipe cards never work, I get stuck in the revolving doors, I get to my office, and actually I've been really looking forward to getting into my office. I get into my office and there's no one else around, and it's all rather dull, and all those other things, you kind of forget. You've kind of forgotten that you've had to go through, all those hurdles. So I think you're right, Robin. I think we're gaining and losing.
Yeah, I think it's also a social aspect to that, because one night, my wife and I both agreed to do a sort of an online Zoom drink catch up with some friends. And I said, I'm going to meet the guys on Friday. She said, I'm meeting the girls. She says, okay, well, you do yours on Friday, I'll do mine on Saturday. It's like, why? Oh yeah, I'm just going to be here. Like, the kids will just be upstairs asleep. There's no, we can do that. We can both do things at the same time, and I'm going to call you when I come back. There's no taxi fee and stuff. There are positives to be gleaned if you want to look for them.
There are real positives, and working. Helen will know this. Working academia, you're doing talks and things, and now you can literally be in two places at once almost, can't you? So before, you go, oh no, I'm doing a talk in London that day. I can't do the local one in Manchester, but now you can do both.
Yeah, but the damage of all of that, and that's one of the other interesting concepts. We are not going to get to question 2, Robin.
Yeah, we are.
Is that there's this false idea of how much you can get done in a day. And actually, there's a worry that when it goes back, there were some things that happen very efficiently like this, but they're kind of, you miss the social. So you basically cut out all the social interaction, the having a coffee beforehand, the having a chat while you're waiting to go on stage. You cut out all the human bits. And then you have the thing which everyone thinks is the bit that matters, but actually that's not the bit that matters quite a lot of the time. It's all the stuff around it. And we've cut all those bits out. And when we go back, there's either going to be this massive realization that actually we spend a lot more time chatting than we thought we did, and it was a good thing. Yeah. Or there's going to be this, like, how do I keep up with the amount of stuff that I was doing? Because I had this sort of false situation which made it look easy, but all the critical human bits were cut out of it. There's this sort of false efficiency there, I think.
Well, whether you want it or not, I'm going to ask a question too, Helen. And it's from Helen Paul, who will be interested to know how EMDR, and if you can explain, I'll start with you, Dean, what EMDR is. I know it's about eye movement. I can't remember the full thing. How that works to resolve post-traumatic stress disorder. So EMDR.
Yes, EMDR, eye movement desensitization. EMDR, eye movement desensitization. I can never remember the actual full name, but it's a thing. Well, basically, it's really hard to actually explain in one bit. It's sort of like when you have it trains you to have different reactions to what's going on in your head via eye movements and things. So, and I'm not sure if my understanding is it's not really about the eye movements, like not like your eyes are sort of the joysticks of your brain, which is sort of just directing the mood in different directions. It's almost like training you to think in different ways, like avoiding the upsetting or the traumatic pathways which you're sort of ingrained. Because obviously when you have a violent trauma of some sort, which lingers, your brain is very much, it's an extremely powerful memory. It's flashbulb memory, in that when you experience something extremely negative, your brain goes into high gear. You sort of take in far more sensory stuff. Your fight-to-flight response goes through the roof. You are tense. You are poised. You don't forget any of it because it's vital survival information. If you get through this, you want to avoid it for the rest of your life, and therefore your brain keeps a very detailed record. But that sometimes goes over the top, and then you have this flashbulb memory, this constant memory, which is constantly triggering and influencing future behavior, and you get PTSD. And all this comes about from your brain thinking, this memory is really important, and it sort of infuses through the rest of your systems, how you work. And EMDR sort of, even at an instinctive level, it sort of gets you to just behave differently, or your brain to do different things in more original pathways, original reflexive thinking, which stops you from necessarily triggering that particular traumatic memory. And a lot of therapy sort of comes around, like CBT and things. You can be at the root. A lot of it is about training your brain or making your brain behave in ways which are less disruptive compared to the disorder that is causing you problems. I know different means, different approaches. They work different ways for different people. Not everyone has the same thing, but at the very basic level, that's what we're trying to do. Trying to get your brain to say, stop doing that, do this instead. And but it can be a stubborn old organ, so that does take time and effort, and not always successful.
So yeah, I mean, that's far more about. So it's about kind of resetting the kind of neural pathway. So I'm kind of interested in it. My area is actually quite often people who hurt themselves, and it's actually been used in people who have self-harmed. Particularly people who have self-harmed as a response to past traumatic experiences, and it seems to have effect. And this is again one of these treatments that has been proven in randomized trials. So people have literally been randomized to proper EMDR and kind of sham EMDR. I'm not quite sure how they do the sham one, but you can randomize people and it shows it has an effect. It's one of these, it's an illustration that some therapies are kind of quite specific. What we're looking for, what we'd ideally like, is a kind of panacea of therapies and treatments that would work across the board. But sometimes some things work a lot better for some things than others.
Yeah, definitely. I think there does seem to be a sort of, based on my quite limited reading in recent years, of some therapies which have things which make the condition a bit more tangible. That's something I've written about a lot recently. And that's one big problem with mental health problems, is that they have no sort of obvious form or shape. So like your mood is disrupted, your anxiety is through the roof. You don't have any thing to pin that on, and that increases uncertainty. You have no obvious response to that, and a lot of therapies try to sort of give it some sort of context, like the avatar therapy. It represents your hallucinations or delusions in a virtual format, which is gives it something to the brain, something to focus on. And EMDR sort of your eye movements become almost like a focus or a tangible response to that. And things like biofeedback or neurofeedback, whereby you become attached to you are attached to monitors which show your heart rate or your blood pressure or your brain waves. And you say, well, rather than stop being anxious, they say, well, can your heart rate's going up, can you try and lower it? And sort of it gives it a more, it gives it form, it gives it structure, it gives it some sort of like, well, I don't know how to know my anxiety, but I can see my heart rate, and I can think about and concentrate on that, and that can become more helpful. It grounds it in a way which a lot of therapies can't really do, because there's no actual physical form to it. So yeah, this could be a way of which sort of a general approach which could be more helpful. But again, it'll depend on the condition, it'll depend on the person, it'll depend on how they perceive and interact with their own problems, rather than just one size.
Right, I'm going to move into the next question, which is this is going to be quite a tricky one, I think, but I might be wrong. Which is depression hereditary? Now, shall I start with you? Because that is
the answer is yes, partly. And that applies for just about anything. So just about anything you can think of, it's partly inherited and it's partly determined by the environment. But I mean, when I was a medical student, there was a, nature nurture, it was about 50-50. I mean, a lot of the, for many, disorders of psychological health, disorders of mental health, there is quite a strong genetic component, actually, quite a high heritability for some of these disorders. But the question is what's inherited, and lots of really kind of clever people try and think about what's inherited. Well, is it the depression itself? Is it the underlying kind of genetic vulnerability? Is there a single gene defect? And no one's really kind of come up with a particular answer. So a lot of mental disorders we think as something called polygenic. So it's perhaps inherited in several different genes that vary across populations. And that isn't the whole story either, because we know probably what's inherited is the susceptibility, and that susceptibility is depending on the experiences you then subsequently have. And what's been intriguing in recent years is the gene-environment interaction. So it's this fascinating idea that actually the experiences you have actually control the gene expression. So it's not only your genes that then determine your vulnerability. The stuff that happens to you then also interacts with your genes and causes expressions of some genes and others. So it's complicated, Robin, but yes, psychiatric disorders are partly inherited, and it does vary. So things like depression have probably got a less of a heritable component than things like, for example, bipolar disorder, where people may have periods of elevated mood and periods of low mood, or things like schizophrenia.
We'll move on. Thank one of the live chat questions. Do you have any tips how to explain to someone who doesn't suffer from anxiety or depression that it is irrational, and the anxious person often knows that but can't change what's happening? So, Dean.
Well, yeah, I think that's obviously one of the big problems with mental health awareness and the campaigns around it. In that, yes, people with these disorders, 99 times out of 100 are fully aware that they are not logical. This doesn't make any sense, but it's happening anyway. But some people hesitate to invoke the body, mental and physical health comparison. But like something with a broken leg. Well, your leg shouldn't be broken. I'm aware of this. Yes, I don't actually want my knee to be facing the wrong way, but it is. So that's it's not a decision I made, and I think it can help to sort of if you can the reason we use these analogies with physical health, because people have a much better understanding or appreciation of physical health problems. It's just far more familiar. You can see them. They are tangible. They are things you can look at and go, well, that's not right, is it? And I think if you can do that with stuff like this, the best example probably is phobias. People who dismiss things like anxiety and depression, they may well have a phobia, a common phobia, as in, like, are you afraid? Would you like to do karaoke? Like, no, that sounds horrible. Why? There's no logical danger to it. I mean, unless you're on a really, really, really rough pub, singing karaoke is not going to cause any physical harm. It's, unless, again, it depends how good you are, I suppose, but it is actually, it's a valid example, as in, or speaking on the phone, or just being flustered because people, you're in front of a queue and you can't find your wallet or something. These are all logically irrational responses, because there's no physical harm, there's no physical problem that'll come from public speaking or like singing in front of strangers, but we fear them anyway. And it's even like something more tangible, like arachnophobia. Talking about spiders, like the average 5-pence size spider across the room is not going to leap across the individual distance and tear your throat out. But people with arachnophobia think that anyway, and they can't stop themselves thinking that because it's irrational. But the brain has developed in such a way where it latches on to that reaction and will maintain it. And the same thing happens with depression, anxiety. People have these experiences. No, they have no root cause a lot of the time, and that's part of the problem. In that there's no logical reason to be as anxious as they are. They don't have any particular traumatic life events to be so depressed about, but they are. If something's happening to them which they can't control, and they don't want to be going through this. That's why therapy exists, and it's worth pointing that out. As in, yes, those are two incompatible things. But yeah, so yes, people are aware that the condition has no logical reason behind it, but it happens anyway because no one said the brain was logical. If anything, it prefers the alternative, and that's a big part of the understanding we're trying to get out there.
That seems to be sometimes it seems to be you are in a position where you're going through anxiety and it's something that you've maybe done for years and years and years, and you know it's not going to, why would it be today that thing happens, that every time you're in that situation you think about it? But sometimes it does actually feel like there is this person sitting at the front of your brain who's trying to explain to the rest of your brain, but the rest of your brain is this kind of pre-language brain. It's this brain that's just this gibbering creature in a cave. You're going, but don't you understand? You're not going to need the toilet when your seatbelt's buckled and you're going up on the plane. It's never happened before, and you went just for you don't understand. It does feel sometimes it becomes quite an animated scenario.
And Dean, how difficult is it to compare? Because obviously, like you said, there's lots of maybes in all of this, but I can see they're also comparing to someone's common experience. So a fear of spiders, for example, where people say, oh, but I have that and I know it's not very bad, so that means I'm not going to take your thing seriously. Is there a risk of that if you compare to, all of us do illogical things, but if is it helpful to make those comparisons because they sort of reduce the idea that some of this is very serious mental health rather than perhaps something which we all do, which is a bit weird, but it doesn't have any consequences?
Well, yeah, that's the tightrope which people have to walk a lot of the time. In that, when you compare things to like a physical ailment, people go, well, I understand that, and it can have negative consequences. Like I've got a book about this right now. As in, if you say to someone like, my mental health problem is just like your chronic lung condition, but then when you associate with physical things, people expect things, well, then you get better, then you get cured, then you get treated, and then you recover from it, which isn't often the case with mental health problems. It's more about management and coping mechanisms and yes, good and bad days and things like that. And yeah, and again, it also is perhaps far more common in things like depression, because I've said it many times, but we should have separate words for clinical depression and everyday depression, because people can say, I was depressed yesterday, and what they mean is they had a low mood. They just weren't happy. Something bad had happened, upset them, and they were miserable. Fair point. But that doesn't mean you know what it's like to experience depression in the clinical sense. But people feel like they do. It's tantamount to someone saying, I had a paper cut, so you've lost a limb, therefore you should stop complaining because my paper cut got better. And that it's not a fair comparison. But again, I think it depends on who you're talking to. And my argument would be that it's good to make these comparisons when you talk to someone who doesn't accept them at all. But if someone's actually engaged and wants to know more, then perhaps they're not as helpful as they otherwise could be.
I think that's right. Yeah. Sorry, Robin.
Sorry, I'm going to throw another because it kind of links the next question. So now, this is from someone who'd like to say, how can I support someone else experiencing mental health problems such as depression if my own mental health is suffering too? So I feel that's kind of another step that we could also move towards in that.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't support someone else unless you're kind of taking care of yourself. So it's almost the first step is, making sure you're in a reasonable place whilst being mindful of people around you. So it's almost that for me is almost the first step. And just going back to the previous point about, you know, the physical illness, mental illness kind of dichotomy, I don't find it particularly helpful. But in recent years, you know, it has been quite helpful in terms of destigmatizing mental illness and getting mental health problems up the agenda. The idea that, you know, mental illness, mental health problems, you know, have the same, if you like, you know, parity of esteem, we call it in the jargon, from physical illnesses, and that I think has been quite helpful. But there are things that are, you know, quite different about psychological health problems and mental illness, and Dean's highlighted some of them. And the comparison, I think, is less than helpful. You know, trying to compare severity or impact. You know, it does affect people. You know, on a very individual level. Different people are affected in different ways. But really, for supporting other people, you've got to be in the right place yourself, because then actually you're going to be a much more effective support of, you know, your loved one or you know, the family, the friend.
And how does that work, Nav? When you know at the moment, the proportion of people suffering mental health issues is higher, right? I think that's been one of the very clear messages ever since March. And so the problem, in a way, is becomes quite. Does it become a difficult balance that, you know, I might, if I ask someone for help and they say, oh, you know, I'm dealing with a lot, I can't help you. Okay, that's fine. And I go and ask the next person, can you help me? And they go, oh, I'm dealing with a lot, I have to look after myself first. And you go, okay. And is there a risk that does it just become harder because people don't have the capacity to help as much?
Of course. Of course it's harder. I mean, I think you raise a really interesting point, is what has been the kind of broad effect of the pandemic on mental health. And you're absolutely right. The evidence suggests that on average, mental health's got a little bit worse, probably about 10% worse in the best studies, but not for everyone, actually, not for everyone. And certainly in the early part of this, some people were reporting positive effects on their well-being, and Robin's described some of them, not having to kind of worry about things, not having to go into the office for example. So the effects of this aren't universal. Yes, on average, people are perhaps people's mental health is a little bit worse, but not drastically worse. You know, you hear all these kind of really alarming stories in the media about, you know, suicide rates, about mental illness. On the whole, they are untrue. Actually, they are untrue. But on average, yes, we are more stressed. Does that mean we're less able to help those near to us? Yes, it does. But I think one of the things I've been astonished by is just how well you know, communities and societies kind of pull together, and that's actually a really potentially important part of, you know, what is an external societal threat. We know from some of the data that actually some of the effects on mental health can be positive. Some of the effects even on suicide rates can be positive, i.e. lower suicide rates when societies kind of are cohesive and pull together. So you're right, it does become more difficult to support others in this context. But I think, you know, I've just been really heartened to see all the examples of people helping each other.
Through, I'll just tell, because we've had so many questions that by the end of the show, I'm going to make sure that even if you're unable to answer them, if you can recommend where people can just go, or different sources, or whatever. So I'm going to try and get through. This one is, why are some people's brains hardwired to hate themselves, and how do you break the cycle of self-loathing? So maybe deal with the second part in particular, the cycle of self-loathing. Dean, do you want to start on that, or Nav?
I'm happy to, but I could. I'm happy to, but I could have said, self-loathing. Dean. Very good. Yeah, I think it's the whole thing about the brain being hardwired to do anything as complex as mood and self-appreciation and things like that. That's a woolly area anyway. Like the brain being hardwired at all for anything beyond the ability to walk, breathe, speak language and stuff is, you know, that's debatable. Obviously, development and how you're brought up is a big part of that. There are plenty of examples of people like who, again, depression does seem to flip the inherent mechanism which we have for self-approval, like self-aggrandizement. Like there's so many different biases in how we recall memory, and they're largely egocentric. Our memory is tweaked and shaped in so many different ways to emphasize, or to enhance the positives that we feel about ourselves, because, in an evolutionary sense, it gives us a sense of confidence. We think, well, I can do this because I am capable, I'm a good person. And we are constantly assessing ourselves, or things like impression management. We want to give the best image of ourselves to other people, which is, again, a big part of why social media can be so intoxicating, because we have far more control of how we come across. But people with depression and similar mood disorders, that sort of seems to be inverted. They far more focus on the negatives and the unpleasant aspects of themselves. And there is a lot of data which shows that negative emotional stimuli does tend to have more of an impact than positive. You could argue that because it often represents a threat, which is more relevant to the brain or what it needs to know. It could be like it's more unfamiliar, which basic general manners. People are generally nice to each other, but if you're insulting, it's like more unusual. It warrants more attention that way. But the brain has some sort of mechanism to get rid of that, like the fading effect bias, whereby the negative emotional content of memory fades faster than the positive one. So in a normal brain, even if you go through hard times or you feel bad about them, they will fade, or you get over them faster. Time will heal faster rather than you forget positive stuff. So again, it really depends where it comes from. It could be a trauma-based thing. It could be, like, say, a genetic quirk which leads to you having these negative experiences. How to break the cycle? Again, it really depends on who you are, what the cause of it is. It's anything which can stop you accepting, like, the negatives about yourself. Anything which can encourage you to think, like, what these negative feelings you're having aren't justified. They aren't based in reality. They aren't actually valid in terms of what we know about the world. I mean, it's a big ask. It's like it's tantamount to telling people to cheer up, which, as anyone with mental health problems who know, is always helpful. It's like no one's ever gone, what a good idea! I've never even thought of cheering up. I mean, where were you 10 years ago? Like, that would have. That's well,
I'm interested in maybe navigate that one of the things that I found this and when I've shared it with people, which is when you increasingly realize, when you're given the evidence that we are not entirely responsible for the actions that we do, that we are part of that moment, because I think sometimes, not obviously in all, but sometimes self-loathing comes from the fact that you think, why have I done that? And you look at an action and you pick it apart and you see yourself as 100% the person controlling the actions of your life, when as we realize there's so much unconsciously going on in the brain. And I know that some people I've spoken to found that just looking at that some help.
This idea that we're of personal responsibility, of actually sometimes just giving ourselves a break, actually being nice to ourselves. And you're right, and Dean's talking about this kind of cycle. I think it's really important, not feeling great about yourself, being depressed, and this kind of cycle. And actually sometimes the feelings of not feeling great about yourselves are a symptom of the depression. Sometimes they're external, sometimes it's kind of rooted deep in childhood. And I'm very loath to give kind of rapid fire answers to these some of these big questions, but I suppose the really important thing is, even when people are in a really, really low place and feeling terrible about themselves, there are, as Dean says, multiple opportunities to kind of break that cycle, whether you're focusing on the depression itself, whether you're focusing on the thoughts, the cognitions about yourself, whether you're looking further back in time, to look at some of the origins of why you might think in the way that you think, and as you say, also this kind of letting yourself off the hook a little bit, saying, actually, this isn't my fault, that thing that I did, actually, maybe it isn't responsible for the way I'm feeling right now. I think that's really important.
And could you say something about the evidence for? So one of the things that I've noticed, especially going through these life events that take a long time, so sort of illnesses of relatives and that kind of thing, when there's this very long period. And one of the things I've noticed personally that has been some of the single most helpful moments that perhaps break not a cycle of depression, but they turn a bad day into one that isn't just a bad day, is when someone basically says, it's okay if you call me, like, I know you're going to do weird things. Basically, you're going through a tough time, you're going to don't be afraid not to call or to speak, because you're worried you're going to come across as a bit odd or a bit and people actually saying to other people, it's okay. Like, I still believe you're you. I understand there's a difficult period. I'm not going to judge you by your behavior during this difficult period. And that's been some of the most reassuring. And I've been very, very fortunate. I've had very good friends who have made that point again and again and again. And you have to hear it. And I just wondered what's the evidence for that sort of thing with helping people when they've got a bad patch, they're in the middle of it, it's coming up, whatever.
I mean, it's almost kind of self-evident that acceptance, that kind of understanding, that kind of communication is helpful. I mean, we know from some of the literature on therapeutic encounters it's going to be helpful, but it's going to be helpful anyway. And just kind of going through all this, just acknowledging that actually I'm having a bad day, and it's okay to have bad days. And that's one of the things I've found kind of very helpful, that actually some days aren't really very good, but the realization that hopefully these things are going to pass. People around me, as you say, that being very supportive, it's that is helpful.
Yeah, and also I will say I found this a lot myself recently. Well, obviously, past all the pandemic, my father passed away. I was under lockdown. I was going through a very tough time, and it was always with the best will in the world to everyone who reached out, because there were plenty of people who did. And a lot of people said, "No, let me know if I can help. Let me know if you need anything." As well, I need loads of things, but you can't do anything about it because we're under lockdown. There's literally no option here. And it was very uncharitable, but I was in a bad place. So I thought, well, it seemed like you're just doing the whole thoughts and prayers thing, as in, let me know if I can help, but you can't. You can't. So this is just a pointless message to make yourself feel better, which it was not. But no, that's where mine went at the time. But what really helped was friends, just like nearby, obviously, who did something without me being asked. And like the request of let me know if you need any help is obviously really well meant, but it's also sometimes more pressure on the person in that, okay, so you want to help, so now I've got to think of a way you can help, and I've got to think of something you can do, which I'm willing to let go of. At this particular point in my life, like my life suddenly had a major foundation kicked out from under it. Like my sense of control of my life is really flimsy right now. Like I'm reeling from that, and I don't want to lose any more control of what I'm going through by finding something or introducing you into it. But when someone else sort of steps up and says, "Right, I'll do this, whether you like it or not," weirdly, I found that more helpful, because I can't do anything about it then, can I? So I've just got to accept it, and that's very nice. So I think if people want to take the initiative helping someone, if they know it is helpful, don't sort of just assume, I bet this person would like me to paint their car for them. And don't do that. That's just confusing for all concerned. But if you know the person well enough to think, well, I know they'd like this, and they're too, they're not in a good place to ask for it, but I'm going to do it anyway. That can be, I think, even more powerful as an intervention, as a helpful.
Then what is the best way? Because if people are thinking, I want this person to know that they can talk, but then you're also worrying about the pressure. Now, I feel that leads people to go, well, what is it better then to return to staying? What for you would have been the kind of the best wording of a message, if you see, because I think there's a lot of different issues for different people in that situation, and that one which is perhaps the broadest one, which places the least pressure during this incredibly pressured time for you, but would have at the same time been something that could have had the potential to be useful.
Well, for me personally, what I wanted is for someone to reach out and tell me exactly what I wanted to hear before I had to figure out what it was that I wanted to hear. Now, that is literally impossible. And I'm going to say that right now. There's no logic to that. I know it's ridiculous, but that would have been the most helpful thing. And that's the thing, it's really hard, because I had different moods on different days. Some days I was really, really low. I didn't want anyone to bother me. Some days I thought, I'm feeling low in a different way. Like, well, no one's called to ask me. No one cares. And it was really hard to chart that. I think what the most helpful thing to me was people who got in touch about sometimes just completely random things, and not ignorant as in, hey, I know I go through a tough time, but I've seen this on telly. Like that was nice. As in, someone said, I know you're there. I'm care. You want to talk about it, that's fine. But if you want to talk about this instead, that's human contact. It's engagement. It shows that someone's there for you, but it also isn't necessarily getting you to go through some more difficult stuff. Yeah, it really depends. From my own experience, it depends on where you are right now with what you're going through, and that isn't. It's hard to tell from the outside. But even asking, saying, "Do you want to talk about this?" or "I'll leave you alone then," because I found that really helped. Someone said, "Do you want to talk about what you're going through or not?" Because I think it's okay to ask. I don't think anyone would really mind being asked, but that's probably.
I reckon that's really really important. I mean, one of the dangers is we overcomplicate this, and people think, oh my God, what is it I exactly need to ask if I'm worried about someone's mental health, or how should I exactly kind of approach it? And actually, we shouldn't kind of overcomplicate this. It's what Dean's saying. What I would urge people to do is ask, how are you? And we can judge whether people want to talk a bit more, or whether they want to talk about the telly, or whether, whether they just want the kind of that social connection. But But what I would say is, don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to ask how people are. Yes, it can be complicated, but you're not going to do any harm by just asking how people are.
And I'd just like to add an observation again from personal experience, which is that I guess we're talking about two slightly overlapping things here. And one is perhaps a mental health problem that exists outside of generalized anxiety and COVID. There's life events like someone dying and someone becoming very ill and that kind of thing. And then there's a specific health issue, which is perhaps a separate thing. But on the case of the life events, so I also lost my father and grandmother this year. And the things that were most helpful were people normalizing it. People saying, oh, I see what you're going through. This is what happened when my dad died. And it actually opens the door to the conversation of not being, like Nav said, there's this, oh, what should I do? Should I ask this? Should I ask that? And that's because we've kind of made those life events a separate thing, or there's a category. What do I do about that category? And actually, if you saw those conversations that made it part of life, these are things that happen to people. This is separate to the major mental health issues. But, I've found that normalization and sharing of experience very helpful in those situations.
I think also,
sorry, Dean.
So it comes back to what you said earlier on, as in one of the reasons why perhaps mental health problems haven't gone as badly as people thought is that this happened. Everyone's got, anecdotally, I've heard people with anxiety feel a lot better now, saying, see, all the stuff I thought was going to happen is happening now. So I was right. And therefore I'm normal like everyone else. And it sort of gives you a bit better grounding. So the worst has happened. I'm still here. So that's, but also like the online communications, everyone's going through the same problems in that respect. So that can be more helpful and therapeutic. There's like some studies that show that people say social media is really bad for mental health, and it can be, certainly. But if you find a community of people who have similar issues and are willing to talk about them, that can be a protective factor. So there are, once again, it's what you make of it. But there's a lot to be said for that. As in, yes, I know what you're going through. Me too. Shall we, do you want to talk about it or not, or should we just compare? Should we just compare notes? That can be really quite a helpful thing in its own right.
Something I found very interesting, Dean, early on when you were talking about dealing with this was your kind of that you almost imagined that because you had an understanding of neuroscience and the brain that most of us don't have, that you might understand what was going on more. But when you actually have something terrible happen to you, again, almost like that bit, perhaps in another way, where there's that bit of the hyper intelligent human at the front that can explain it all, but that it doesn't change ultimately the emotional impact and sometimes the destruction. Yeah,
well, the analogy I use is like being a neuroscientist going through the intense grief and the all the stuff that comes from that. It's sort of like being an expert mechanic inside a car screaming out of control. Like, I know why this is happening, but I'm not really placed to do anything about it right now. So I'm just gonna have to ride it out and hope that it comes to a restful stop. And again, I know why this occurred. I know the physics of what's going on. Not really helping at the moment. It's just giving me a better idea of why this is happening. But again, can be helpful. A lot of time I thought, well, I'm in a very, very low state today, but I know why that is. I know what's going on. I can sort of brace myself. But is that because I've got the scientific insight, or is that just because the sort of character I am? I don't know. I don't have a control Dean to go through a different life experience and see what he does. But yeah, so again, it could be helpful. But I think any sort of insight to what's going on inside you can be helpful. That's sort of the whole basis of my writing career. But yeah, so I like to think maybe it did help, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's I think that's an important distinction.
I have been trying to make the thing that was grown in the Petri dish is very unimpressive so far.
But this whole expert thing, so I've been doing research into mental health, research into suicidal behaviour for 25 years. But actually, it's the expert. What's changed in recent years is the real kind of recognition of the importance of experts by experience. We ask people who are going through it, and they give kind of complementary insights. So in terms of mental health research, that kind of, if you like, that conjoining of the experts, the science, but actually the experiential thing is really, 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 really powerful, because you get insights from people that you don't get, you don't get when you're doing the stats or the epidemiology.
Absolutely.
Right. We've say that and I also know there were loads online as well. I don't know if it's the same panel. We'll ask them, but not online. It's placed them under an enormous amount of pressure. So like when I asked you to marry me, Dean, when we were on stage together at St David's Hall, it was a bad timing. It put you under too much social pressure.
Wife wasn't pleased, but yeah.
I put the offer out to both of you. That's why we were going to join the Church of Mormonism, which I have no idea if that's actually true. The Church of Mormonism. I'd like to apologise to. Anyway, look. So, but we are going to do a follow up. So because we've had so many questions, and because we haven't been able to, so I think hopefully within about maybe 2 weeks time or 3 weeks time, we're going to deal with all of the questions that we've had so far, because there were just so many. And of course, as everyone has said, and Nav and Dean, you know, a lot of these things you can't just say, oh, here's a quick answer. So the final one I wanted to, it is about suicidal thoughts, and I think it's quite an important question. This is, how common is it for people to have suicidal thoughts? I realise there are levels. Is it very common to think, however, briefly kill yourself? I have them daily at various levels, and now only the higher level affect me. But I'm sure everyone can't be living with that. So Nav, what are the different levels?
I mean, it's perhaps more common than many people might think, you know, and it varies by age group. So, you know, 1 in 10 is obvious, is sometimes a kind of figure that's out there. But you can't think of suicidal thoughts as just one thing. So, you know, the person raising the question, it's kind of implicit in the question, you know, for some people they're fleeting thoughts. For other people, they're more prolonged. For other people, you know, those thoughts actually might turn into an intention to act. For other people, you know, they might have actually hurt themselves. So it is this spectrum. It's more common than you might think. For example, you know, it's one of the most common reasons that people attend emergency departments in this country. It's one of the commonest reasons for hospital admission in this country is people having hurt themselves. About 200,000 people per year. The really important question is actually, you know, people who hurt themselves. There are treatments available, talking treatments, other things that we know have an evidence base. Suicide itself is very much preventable, so it's been one of the things we've been working hard over the last few months. Just getting that message out there is important before it remains important. I mean, one of the other things I'm constantly asked about is what's happened to suicide rates during the pandemic. You know, we're seeing reports of suicide rates having gone up now, you know, drastically. I must say that's not true at the moment. The best indications we have is suicide rates haven't gone up. I mean, we need to keep a close eye on them. Obviously, the kind of economic fallout and other things. But you know, suicidal thoughts, you know, are really important. But they're, you know, there are lots of things that can potentially help with them.
Sorry.
I was saying it's also worth mentioning that suicidal thoughts could also be one form of like taboo thinking. The fact that, you know, our brain has a mental model of how things work, how things will pan out, and what we should and shouldn't do. And but these are boundaries, and a lot of the time we will just spontaneously think of doing something which we shouldn't do. Like people have the same thing, like standing on a cliff edge. What if I jumped? Or if I pushed this person on the train tracks? What if I did this? Or if I did that? And it's sort of like, in a way, it's, you know, the brain is always like running simulations and things. It's almost like go to the boundaries and testing an electric fence. So say, is that live? Yep, that's live. And it's when you can't stop thinking these things, that's when it becomes sort of an issue. But yeah, so it can be very you know, it's perhaps more common you think, as in, what if I did this? What if I did that? What if I kill myself? And that's, but as a pure hypothetical, as in that scenario, what would happen, rather than it's something I actually want to do. So when you cross the line from one to the other, that's when we have, you know, problems.
I know a very good book written by an idiot that deals with that, actually. Oh, look, there it is. That was one of the most interesting things when I first started doing stand-up about intrusive thoughts, impulsive thoughts, and was the number of people who come up to you afterwards, and the number of people who would never. I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it? We can talk about this next time we do this, but if you are in a position where you're allowed to open your inner thoughts and you've got an alibi, and of course comedians do have an alibi, it's very I mean, I was going to mention, when you're talking about kind of, you know, suicide ideation, Laura Davis is a fantastic Australian comedian, I think based in the UK now, and she did a show called Cake in the Rain, and she has about every half an hour she thinks about killing herself. And she said, you know, and she turned it to go, and she said she's found it very useful, because what happens is every half an hour she goes, why am I not going to do it? Oh yeah, because I'm doing that really good blog about all the trees in that park. So she said, you know, it is a thing. It is very often not attached to anything which is going on in her life. The thought occurs roughly every 30 minutes. And what she does is she then very quickly makes a list in her head of all of the positive things and all the things that she wants to do. And that if you get a chance, I would highly recommend, Laura Davis's Cake in the Rain. I don't know if it's online anywhere or whatever, but it's a very interesting, but as you were saying, it's a very interesting thing, as we all know, that what goes on inside, and the fact that an enormous number of people are not in a social situation or a professional situation and those things where they feel they can dare to share some of our stranger thoughts. And when you do share the stranger thoughts, very often you'd be surprised by how many people say, oh, I had that thought, or I sometimes think about suicide, or whatever it might be. And I think that's, such an important part. And I know that all of your work, all of you, that this is something you deal with. But it wouldn't be a Sunday Science Q&A without at least at one point leading to some kind of announcement about the ocean. So, Helen?
I just that's a left turn of the traffic lights, is it? From suicidal thoughts to the ocean. Well done. Although thinking about the ocean is definitely good for mental health. So next week, when we talk about the ocean, I just wanted to clarify, it's not quite pollution. What we're going to be talking about is things moving around the ocean, and that's all kinds of things. Some of it is pollution, but there is also life and heat and chemistry of various sorts. And so the topic of next week is going to be things that move around the ocean. So if you've got questions on any of those things or anything else around the ocean, just wanted to provide a little bit of theme, send them in, let us know, because it's now 4:00 and therefore you're officially allowed to think about the ocean instead of mental health, should you choose to.
Right, yeah, we're really going to get that done. The only thing you're allowed to ask about is anything that moves in the ocean, or any ideas of the ocean, or any conjecture about the ocean. Oh, we'll get through that in 30 minutes, I'm sure. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I said, I'm so sorry. We did have an enormous number of questions, and we wanted to make sure that we dealt with them as fully as possible. I hope that maybe sometime, maybe 2 or 3 weeks' time, we will do a follow-up and we will just go through all of those things. I hope we've been able to deal with some of... I tried as much as possible to deal with the questions which seem to have some kind of immediacy to them, but there were a lot of other different interesting questions, philosophical questions, etc., about mental health. So we'll be back with that. As Helen mentioned, we're going to be doing anything that moves in the ocean next, which means we're just going to end up doing at least an hour on the octopus, as usual. And why not? Why not? Of course. And for Cosmic Shambles things, well, as I said, if you are able to support us via Patreon, we really try. We need to now try and up it, because it's been quite a long period of time of not working, just to keep making as much stuff as we are able to make. And I hope you're enjoying the stuff. As I said, Tim Peake interview next week. Mark Watson's interview is out now. Rebecca Ragsykes interview as well. And we've got a new series that I'm doing with Alan Moore and Stuart Lee and various others, which we'll be announcing very, very soon. Thank you very much to our producer, Trent Burton, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your work. Can I, in fact, very quickly just ask you one, if each one of you would like to recommend just one single book, doesn't have to be one of your own, Dean, because you won't be able to remember all the titles, you write 3 a year, but a single book that you found particularly helpful in terms of mental health for a broad audience.
Oh, Nav's got one there.
I've got one there. I'm near my bookshelf. So it's the Kathleen Jamie book, the Findings book, and it's kind of beautifully. She's this kind of Scottish poet and writer, and it's a kind of nature book, but it's about the kind of magic in the everyday, really, and it's very kind of contemplative, and I really kind of enjoyed it, and so that's my recommendation, Robin.
And Dean, I can actually say your books are tremendously useful. You know,
yes.
The Idiot Brain, both of them are filled with things which perhaps professionals would eventually almost forget, that there's so many things that no one knows about. And I found both of those books, and also there's the name of that book for teenagers, which is great, about
what to do, why your parents are driving up the wall and what to do about it, which I have like 30 right behind me there, because I got those ready to do publicity stuff before the pandemic kicked in. Oh, that's nice.
Are they for teenagers, Steve?
Yeah, well, 11 to 16-year-olds, yes. But
I've got 3. I might get a few copies.
Oh, thanks, yes.
Right, so Dean, what's your name on eBay? I can't remember what your And Helen, if you've got, I mean,
so actually, it's more along the lines that Nav was talking about. But I would recommend some of the books about Indigenous stories about their relationship to the world. So there's a very good book called "The Right to Be Cold," written by an Alaskan activist who is talking about the native way of life. And one of the themes that comes up in that is that they don't see these things as separate. You know, they don't see mental and physical health as being separate to nature, for example. And I think their worldview really links in with it is the reason we find nature relaxing and it's good for our mental health and all of that. And they haven't got the distinctions. So I recommend the books where there's a good Indigenous leaders describing their view on the world, actually, because I think some of that perspective is really helpful.
And I've just started reading this. This is by Susanna Callahan, who wrote an interesting book called Brain on Fire about her own personal experience of getting encephalitis and how it was not diagnosed. And Great Pretender is about David Rosenhan's experiments of being sane in insane places, as far as I remember, was the title of his paper. It was a very interesting idea of how difficult it really is to define what sanity is. Adam Phillips, I think, Going Sane is a very interesting book by Adam Phillips about actually what is sanity, rather than defining insanity. What's sanity?
It's the whole basis for a 2-hour show, Robin.
Right, well, we're going to be back, and that's part 2, therefore will be in 2 weeks' time. I'll see you there. Thank you for saying yes, though we take that as a yes, obviously. Thanks again to Trent Burton. Follow us, as I said, keep up to date with cosmicshambles.com, and 12th December midday we will start our 24-hour show. Go to the cosmicshambles.com site. You'll find out, as I said, Chris Hadfield, Brian Cox, Sophie Ellis-Bextor, Helen Sharman, many other. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.